In the early hours, a sizable black Cadillac arrives at a garage situated in the northern section of the city. This venue serves as a storage site for Bucks Moran's gang, a well-known figure in Chicago's criminal underworld. Four men emerge from the car, wielding automatic firearms. Among them, two are clad in police uniforms. Meanwhile, 7 individuals inside the garage anxiously await a shipment of illicit alcohol. Upon spotting the officers in uniform at the entrance, the gangsters suspect yet another police raid, an all too frequent occurrence during Prohibition. The uniformed agents command all members of Bucks Moran's gang to press against the wall. In an instant, the police unleash a barrage of gunfire from their automatic weapons. All 7 men lined up against the wall fall lifeless to the ground. The reporters who arrive at the scene are confronted with a gruesome massacre. This ruthless killing will forever be remembered as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The case remains unresolved even today. The identity of those responsible and their motives are still a mystery. Yet, back in 1929, most Chicagoans, along with people across the nation, are certain Al Capone, the most notorious gangster, orchestrated it. He is credited with several hundred murders, varying from high-profile assassinations to personally eliminating rivals with a bat. Furthermore, his criminal empire included extortion, underground casinos, brothels, and, of course, vast quantities of illegal liquor. This paints a typical portrait for the leading criminal figure, but the reality is more complicated. Countless tales surrounding his criminal activities. Capone stands as the most notorious gangster. He is linked to several hundred murders, from high-profile hits to personally eliminating competitors with a bat. Additionally, his criminal exploits included extortion, underground casinos, brothels, and, of course, streams of illegal alcohol. This may seem like a straightforward resume for the leading criminal figure, yet the truth is more complex. Many accounts of his crimes are cloaked in myth. To uncover the reality of it all, how a 20-year-old from a poor immigrant background ascended to become the king of the criminal underworld in just a few years, only to see that power unravel just as quickly. To grasp how Al Capone's name has attained legendary status, one could easily cite statistics on Google searches, media mentions, and references in popular culture. However, a far more revealing aspect of the gangster's mythologization is that even his own grandchildren address him not as Grandpa, but as Al Capone. It's rare to find a historical figure whose legend has so dramatically eclipsed the actual individual. Let's slowly begin to distinguish one from the other. The gangster's name is mainly linked to Chicago. However, our protagonist will come to this city as an adult and through an unfortunate incident. In reality, the tale starts in New York. At the close of the 19th century, a young family with 2 small sons arrives there. The surname Capone is quite common in the Naples region of Italy, and among the many Italian immigrants in America during that time, there were a notable number of Capones. This city is where our protagonist will arrive as an adult and under unfortunate circumstances. In truth, the narrative begins in New York. At the end of the 19th century, a young family with 2 small sons made their way there. The surname Capone is prevalent in the Naples region of Italy, and among the many Italian immigrants in America at that time, there were several families with the Capone name. Among the other Italian immigrants, the father initially faces tough, low-paying jobs before discovering his passion as a barber and opening his own salon. While this venture doesn't generate much income, it will eventually enable him to provide for a large family of 9 children, 7 of whom will be born in America. The middle child will be a boy named Alfonso. This takes place in the year 1899. At the turn of the century, Italians in America weren't precisely second-class citizens, but they were often linked to low status, labor-intensive, and unskilled jobs. This background would significantly shape Capone's future. Throughout his life, he would often voice his frustration by declaring, "I am not Italian. I was born in Brooklyn." At the start of the century, children from large Italian immigrant families find it difficult to fit into cramped apartments, which leads them to spend much of their time outdoors, on the streets. Al and his brothers, along with their father, work tirelessly, not just because 9 children need to be fed. He is well aware that without money, his sons, not Italian. I was born in Brooklyn at the beginning of the century. Children from large Italian immigrant families find it challenging to adapt to cramped apartments, which is why they often spend their time outdoors, on the streets. The Capone brothers, Al and their father, put in a great deal of effort, not just because 9 children need to be fed. He knows that without money, his sons will likely leave school and resort to earning on the streets, which most probably will lead them towards crime. It's worth noting that Al Capone performs well in school. His strengths lies in mathematics, English, and interacting with his classmates. All of these skills will later be invaluable for the future mobster. His income, when converted to today's currency, will near billions of dollars. His command of English will facilitate communication with reporters, while his talent for building relationships will allow him to establish a sprawling underground empire. Therefore, if you're still a student watching this video, be sure to study diligently. It will benefit you in life. However, despite his parents' efforts and his academic achievements, Capone leaves school at around 14 years old to start working. His older brothers had taken the same path before him. The eldest brother, Jimmy, aimed to conquer Hollywood but never succeeded. He vanished and would only emerge again 30 years later. The following 2 brothers, Ralph and Frank, quickly turned to a life of crime. Al, in contrast, begins with entirely legal jobs, including working at a printing factory, because his older brothers had followed the same course. The eldest, Jimmy, pursued a dream of Hollywood but never succeeded. He vanished and would only reappear 30 years later. The next 2 brothers, Ralph and Frank, rapidly delved into crime. Al, however, takes a different path by starting with completely legal jobs, including working at a printing factory. Since life in the Italian neighborhoods during that time unfolds on the streets, everyone is aware of their neighbors' activities and lifestyles. By the age of 14 or 15, Al Capone is recognized as a friendly yet unremarkable teenager, not involved in any illegal activities. After he rises to become the king of the mafia, many legends will emerge about how Al, as a teenager, expertly fought with sailors, dealt ruthlessly with his Irish counterparts, and even assaulted a teacher. In truth, the story about the sailors is entirely fictional. Conflicts between Italians and Irish in New York during that era were frequent, and while it's likely that Capone was involved in some of these clashes, he did not brutalize anyone to the brink of death. The incident involving the teacher seemingly did take place, but reports range from a routine argument to a severe knockout in which the teacher was felled by a blow from his student. Given the mythologizing of our hero, I lean toward the less sensational account. In a way, it is Capone's father who sets him on the path to crime. He sends him to work as a janitor. The incident with the teacher seemingly took place, but accounts range from a standard argument to a severe knockout, in which the teacher was struck down by his student. Considering the mythologizing of our hero, I prefer the less sensational interpretation. In a way, it is Capone's father who steers him toward crime. He sends him to work as a shoe-shine boy on a bustling street in Brooklyn. There, the teenager witnesses how local authorities extort small businesses, and an idea for a business plan starts to take shape in his mind. Capone begins engaging in small-scale racketeering, collecting tribute from the boys who shine shoes in the area, supposedly offering them protection. The operation starts to expand, and Capone begins recruiting helpers to manage an even larger group of shoe shiners. The enterprise quickly falls apart. Capone lacks genuine power at that time, and the local toughs overpower the pimp's business. However, his abilities do not go unnoticed. Notorious figure Johnny Torrio offers Capone a job. Every newcomer hired by Torrio underwent a psychological assessment. They would be invited into the boss's office and left alone for a brief period. Meanwhile, money would be left on the boss's desk. Those who resisted the temptation and did not take any cash were given an opportunity to work in the organization. Capone successfully passes the test, marking the beginning of his criminal career. The story of Capone and Torrio exemplifies how a student not only surpasses his teacher, but also... Meanwhile, money was left on the boss's desk. Those who resisted the temptation and refrained from taking any bills were granted an opportunity to work in Capone's organization. He passes the test, marking the start of his criminal career. The narrative of Capone and Torrio illustrates how a student not only eclipses his teacher, but also completely overshadows him in history. During the 1910s and 1920s, Torrio was viewed as a mafia mastermind. He simultaneously led large gangs in two cities, New York and Chicago. In the early stages, Capone is merely a runner delivering messages. While there's nothing illegal about it, the income significantly surpasses what he could earn shining shoes. The teenager diligently brings all the money home. However, there's no reason to be mistaken. Al Capone, though not directly involved at that time, cannot be unaware of Johnny Torrio's actual activities, namely a network of brothels, racketeering, extortion, and murder. Gradually, Capone is assigned increasingly significant responsibilities. It is not precisely known when young Al fully made the transition to the criminal world. Accounts from various biographers differ on this topic. Some assert that by the age of 18, he was already responsible for multiple murders, while others maintain that at most, he was simply involved in collecting revenue from the brothels owned by his boss. What can be stated with certainty is that by this time, Capone was already engaged in delivering messages and, The precise moment he transitioned to the criminal underworld remains unclear. Biographers offer differing accounts on this matter. Some insist that by the age of 18, he was already responsible for multiple murders, while others suggest that at most, he was engaged in collecting revenue from the brothels belonging to his boss. What can be stated with certainty is that by this time, Capone was engaged in delivering messages and collecting money, with his personal circumstances playing a significant role as well. At 18, Al meets a girl named Mary Collins, or May. She works at a box manufacturing factory where Capone is also employed. During this period, he still holds a legal job as a guise. For May, Capone does not seem an obvious choice for a boyfriend. She hails from a more educated and affluent family, is a few years older than him, and is ultimately Irish. In 1918, they plan to marry. However, due to the tense relations between the Italian and Irish communities in early 20th century New York, such unions are not particularly supported by either society or the church. However, by the time of their marriage, the couple already has a 1-month-old son, Albert. Thus, neither society nor the church truly has a choice in the matter. May is not the first girl in Capone's life. By the age of 20, he already possesses quite a substantial sexual history. His involvement with the many brothels owned by his boss certainly has its repercussions. At 16, Al contracts his first case of gonorrhea. They have a 1-month-old son named Albert. Thus, neither society nor the church truly has a choice in the matter. May is far from being the first girl in Capone's life. By the time he reaches 20, he already possesses significant sexual experience. His employment in the various brothels owned by his boss comes with consequences. At 16, Al contracts his first case of gonorrhea, and by 20, he contracts syphilis. He will transmit these illnesses to his young wife, who in turn will pass them on to their newborn son, subjecting him to numerous health issues from an early age. Capone's sexual life becomes even more active after marriage, but Alphonse feels no conflict of interest in this regard. It's akin to classic Hollywood mafia films. The wife is seen as the Madonna, and the mother, enjoying a unique status and position. There are numerous mistresses, most of whom lead separate lives that do not overlap with the family. May is likely aware of her young husband's criminal activities, but it remains unclear whether she knows about his connections with prostitutes, and she certainly does not know about the transmission of syphilis. This is not the only detail Capone has withheld from his wife. It is doubtful that he disclosed the true story behind the origin of his infamous facial scar, arguably Capone's most recognizable feature, even more iconic than his well-known hat. The scarred face has become one of Al's nicknames, as well as a prominent title. The transmission of syphilis is not the only detail Capone has concealed from his wife. It is unlikely that he shared the true story behind the origin of his famous facial scar. This scar is arguably Capone's most distinctive attribute, even more renowned than his famous hat. The scarred face serves as one of Al's nicknames and is also the title of several popular films inspired by his life story. Let's begin with the fact that there are actually 3 scars. The origins of these scars are shrouded in mystery. However, one prevalent version suggests that Capone had an altercation in a bar. he allegedly complimented an unfamiliar Italian woman on her beautiful backside. Her slightly intoxicated brother did not take kindly to the remark, leading to a brawl. During the scuffle, Al's opponent either broke a bottle or drew a knife. In any event, he inflicted a slash, and the assailant did not survive long after the incident. However, it was revealed that he was a member of the same gang. The conflict was quickly resolved, but the prominent scar remained for life. A year after the wedding, Capone's father passed away from a heart attack. One of his older brothers had already vanished, and the other two, despite their ongoing involvement in the criminal underworld, were not in a position to support the family or provide for their mother and numerous younger relatives. Aiello now has two entire families. Following the wedding, Capone's father passed away from a heart attack. One of Al's older brothers had already gone missing, and the other two, despite their continual involvement in the criminal underworld, were unable to take charge of the family and support their mother, along with a substantial number of younger relatives. Aiello now has two entire families to support, leaving no time for a low-paying job at the box factory. The only path to substantial income is through progress in the criminal underworld, and boss Capone is willing to assist. Alongside completing individual tasks, which almost certainly included contract killings, Al works as a bartender. During one of the standard trips to brothels to collect payments, Capone has a run-in with a patron. Al nearly beats him to death. It turns out that the victim is a member of a rival Irish gang, and its leader vows to retaliate by killing the attacker. As punishment and for safety reasons, boss Capone sends him to work in Chicago, where Johnny Torrio also holds interests. Consequently, Al Capone arrives in a city where he will take just 6 years to establish himself as the king of the criminal underworld, another 6 to reach the pinnacle of power, and then suddenly lose it all. Initially, Capone's duties in Chicago mirror those in New York. He collects money from brothels and serves as a bouncer in his boss Al's establishments. In the city, where he will become the king of the criminal world in just 6 years, then spend another 6 at the top before abruptly losing it all, Capone initially carries out the same responsibilities as in New York. He collects money from brothels and works as a bouncer in his boss's establishments. Al, together with his wife and son, rents a modest apartment. By this time, she is already aware of her husband's frequent meetings with prostitutes. However, they are not yet taking on the role of regular mistresses, mainly because the young member of the criminal organization does not have much money to spend. It's hard to determine how the fate of the most famous gangster would have played out, or if he would have ever earned that title without a significant historical event. In January 1920, an unusual robbery occurred in the United States. At first, it seemed rather commonplace. A train was held up, but the thieves were not after gold bars or cash. Instead, they targeted something equally valuable at the time: whiskey. Shortly before this, a new amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution that would come to be known as Prohibition. This amendment outlawed the sale and production of alcohol in the country. Over the next decade, this would profoundly impact the lives of the entire nation and significantly alter our hero's biography. In fact, Al Capone's transformation was largely a result of Prohibition. soon Chicago. This was the time when a new amendment was added to the U.S. Constitution, which would be known as Prohibition. It prohibited the sale and production of alcohol throughout the country. Over the next decade, this would significantly transform the lives of the entire nation and certainly impact our hero's biography. In fact, Al Capone's emergence as a prominent figure was largely influenced by Prohibition. Shortly thereafter, Chicago became the epicenter of violent conflicts, corrupt politicians, and unscrupulous police officers. For nearly a decade, residents would find reports in the newspapers of yet another murder, a warehouse robbery involving illegal alcohol, battles between rival gangs, and various other crimes. According to researchers from that era, about 700 murders connected to local gang conflicts took place in Chicago during the 20s, with Capone responsible for nearly a third of these crimes. However, we will delve into this in more detail a bit later. The first significant responsibility for our hero is overseeing the finances of the boss's businesses. He is responsible for accounting and tax evasion. Capone's income rises substantially. Although Al continues to work, including in brothels, he makes an effort to publicly distance himself from this involvement. Capone portrays himself as a respectable businessman, dresses impeccably, and creates business cards using fictitious names. One of his most well-known aliases is Al Brown. It is as Al Brown that he will oversee the furniture business that our hero employs as Al continues to work, including in brothels, while attempting to publicly distance himself from this activity. Capone presents himself as an upstanding businessman. He dresses smartly and produces business cards with fictitious names. One of his most recognized aliases is Al Brown. It is under the name Al Brown that he will manage the furniture business that our hero uses as a legitimate front. In simple terms, bribery and corruption among officials nationwide surged following the introduction of Prohibition, with Chicago authorities gaining particular notoriety for their readiness to accept payoffs. In essence, the dynamic between the mafia and the city's authorities can be summarized as follows. We provide you with money and assist you in getting elected. In exchange, you simply need to look the other way when it comes to our activities related to alcohol production and distribution. Capone funnels payments to politicians and police through his brother Frank. This is a particularly notable detail. First, Al brings two of his older brothers, Ralph and Frank, to work alongside him in Chicago. Second, it serves as a striking illustration of Capone's clever approach to business. Throughout his career, he conducts all his illegal activities through intermediaries. Consequently, for many years, the special prosecutor will have no charges to bring against him. The gangster will not face any accusations of murder, extortion, running brothels, or bribery. While Capone appears to excel in political maneuvering, one day it culminates in a significant tragedy. More specifically, throughout his career, he will carry out all his illegal activities through intermediaries. For many years, the special prosecutor will find nothing to charge him with. The gangster will not face any accusations of murder, extortion, running brothels, or bribery. Although Capone seems to thrive in political maneuvering, one day it escalates into a major tragedy, or rather, in a certain light, into a tragic comedy. Here's what I mean. In 1924, local elections occur in Chicago. Capone seeks the victory of a loyal Republican candidate to effectively continue his underground operations. However, all indications suggest that the Democratic Party opponent is favored to win. Al, accompanied by his brother Frank and other gang members, arrives at the crucial polling location and physically coerces voters to make the desired choice. The situation intensifies, prompting the police to be summoned to the scene. For some reason, they arrive in an unmarked vehicle. As they approach, they nearly run down Frank Capone, who is crossing the street. Instinctively, he draws his weapon. The officers in the car perceive this as a cue to strike, and gunfire ensues. Frank and several other gang members are killed in the exchange of fire. Thus, a series of absurd coincidences resulted in a significant personal tragedy for Al Capone. It appears he was simply unaware that ballot stuffing could be done discreetly. The ensuing years would likely turn out to be the most perilous for Capone, marked by conflicts among the city's gangs. The officers in the vehicle perceived this as a cue to attack, leading to an outbreak of gunfire. Frank and several other gang members are killed during the shooting. Consequently, a series of absurd coincidences resulted in a significant personal tragedy for Al Capone. It appears he was simply unaware that ballot stuffing could be done quietly. The following years are likely to be the most perilous for Capone. Conflicts among the city's gangs are escalating. Johnny's gang integrates into Capone's organization, which is primarily made up of individuals with Italian heritage. This group originated even before Prohibition was enacted. However, it is during the 1920s that it reaches its peak development. During this period, the organization becomes one of the dominant gangs in the city, controlling hundreds of underground bars, numerous brothels, and casinos. Capone and his organization, being the leading figures of the gang, naturally become targets for elimination by rivals. The first assassination attempt on Capone takes place in 1925. A passing car opens fire on a restaurant where Al has stopped for lunch. He survives along with the other patrons, though nearby parked cars suffer significant damage. This incident is also significant as it marks, if not the very first instance, at least one of the earliest uses of a Thompson submachine gun in gangland confrontations. From that moment onward, they will increasingly utilize this weapon, making it a key component of mafia conflicts throughout history. A few weeks after the onset of the Prohibition era, another assassination attempt takes place. Additionally, it is significant as it marks, if not the first, at least one of the earliest instances of a Thompson submachine gun being used in gangland conflicts. From that point forward, this weapon will be employed more frequently and become a defining feature of mafia conflicts throughout the Prohibition era. A few weeks later, another assassination attempt takes place. This time, the target is Johnny Torrio, who is less fortunate than Capone. The assassins ambush him near his home and, after firing several shots, depart, believing the mobster to be dead. However, Torrio manages to survive. After his discharge from the hospital, Torrio assumes leadership of the branch organization in 1925, with the 6-year-old Capone stepping into his role. The following 6 years will be a period of rising prominence for him. Several years earlier, Capone had acquired a home in a respectable middle-class neighborhood in Chicago, where he lived with his wife and son, along with his mother and younger relatives. Now that he has become the head of the branch, Capone could easily afford much more opulent real estate. Nevertheless, this residence will remain his sole home in Chicago. In other areas, Capone spares no expense. His extravagant sense of style is destined to be remembered in history. Hats and lavish suits that cost $5,000, equivalent to 10 times that amount today. Furthermore, Al can order as many as 20 suits at a time from a tailor. However, this location will remain his only home in Chicago. In other ways, Capone spares no expense. His extravagant fashion sense will undoubtedly be remembered in history. Hats and lavish suits that cost $5,000, which is equivalent to 10 times that amount by today's standards. Additionally, Al is capable of ordering as many as 20 suits at once from Portneuf. Sadly, black and white photography fails to fully convey the vibrancy of the mobster's outfits. Some of his suits might have been lime green, lavender, or a deep banana yellow. In essence, substantial wealth doesn't always equate to good taste. Capone's generosity also went beyond his personal expenses, encompassing lavish clothing and jewelry for his wife, gifts for relatives and acquaintances, and cash handouts to complete strangers. Once, as the legend goes, the gangster purchased an entire stack of newspapers from a young boy selling them. There are numerous tales like this. Even if some are embellished, the broader narrative remains evident. Later on, Capone would initiate more charitable acts, such as establishing a free cafeteria for the unemployed. Overall, it's not surprising that during the 1920s, many viewed the top gangster as a benefactor of the people rather than a ruthless killer and mobster. For his organization's headquarters, Al rents several floors in a nice hotel, though not because he's fond of complimentary breakfasts. For instance, he established a free cafeteria for the unemployed. It's not surprising, then, that in the 1920s, many viewed the top gangster more as a benefactor to the people than as a cold-blooded killer and mobster. For his organization's headquarters, Al rents several floors in a luxurious hotel, but it's not due to his love for complimentary breakfasts or 24-hour concierge service. Rather, it offers a strategic location for conducting his business. It provides easy access for meetings with partners and mistresses, hosting extravagant parties, and establishing round-the-clock security at every corner. Another layer of security comes in the form of a vehicle. Capone purchases a costly armored Cadillac with bulletproof windows. At times, the gangster stays away from home for months, communicating with his family exclusively by phone if the risk of an assassination attempt becomes too significant. These security measures do not appear excessive, especially considering that after the initial shooting in DPM, there would be at least 12 attempts on Capone's life. The group is already a large and effective organization prior to Capone's leadership. However, it is Al who transforms it into a massive underground empire. The operation will be so efficiently managed that many years later, economists from Harvard University will examine it as a case study. At the helm of the organization is Capone himself, supported by a board of directors made up of 12 members, each in charge of a specific domain: brothels, casinos, alcohol, and more. One of the directors, the name Al, will transform it into a sprawling underground empire. The operations will be so meticulously organized that many years later, they will become a subject of study for economists from Harvard University. Leading the organization is Capone himself, supported by a board of directors consisting of 12 members, each overseeing their own area: brothels, casinos, alcohol, and more. Notably, one of the directors is Al's own brother, Ralph. Beneath the directors, there are hundreds of lower-ranking operatives, creating a complex and expansive structure. Simultaneously, Capone himself remains disconnected from both illegal activities and financial transactions. The business's effectiveness is most strikingly demonstrated by the figures. In the latter half of the 1920s, the organization will control nearly 70% of various sectors of Chicago's underground business. The total revenue will surpass $100 million annually, equating to over $1 billion today. The majority of this revenue originates from the illegal production and distribution of alcohol, commonly referred to as bootlegging, which flourishes through bribery, the assassination of rivals, and a complacent societal attitude. Concurrently, the media is experiencing rapid growth. Newspapers, radio, and news segments preceding movie screenings will extensively report on the activities of the charismatic gangster. Over time, Capone will emerge as the first mafia superstar in history, not just in the United States, but also internationally. The first incident that captures substantial media attention takes place in 1920. Simultaneously, the media is undergoing rapid expansion. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and news segments before movie screenings will vigorously report on the exploits of the charismatic gangster. Over time, Capone will rise to become the first mafia superstar in history, both in the United States and internationally. The initial occurrence that draws considerable media attention takes place in 1920. In Chicago, young prosecutor Max Wieg is killed. He was recognized for publicly vowing to incarcerate Gangster No. 1, yet this did not stop him from occasionally mingling with notable mobsters, including Capone. By the time of his murder, Max Wieg had established such a reputation that authorities would immediately consider him in any high-profile crime in the city. However, despite all the efforts of law enforcement, they are unable to establish any link between Capone and the crime. Gradually, the king of Chicago's underground realm comes to understand that the press can be influenced to a certain degree. Even before social media emerges, Capone recognizes the significance of cultivating a personal brand. He starts to pay journalists, a tactic already proven effective with politicians and police officers. Why not apply it to the media as well? The journalists in his employ highlight Capone's charitable efforts in their articles and vividly portray the moral anguish of an innocent Chicagoan suddenly accused of horrific crimes. At times, the mobster also invites members of the press. At times, the mobster invites members of the press to his residence. Upon arrival, they are welcomed by Al in a bathrobe and a friendly smile. He portrays himself as an ordinary family man who, of course, has never taken a life, and whose family is deeply distressed by the many slanders reported in the newspapers. Meanwhile, murders in the city persist without interruption, despite Capone's efforts to negotiate with other mafia leaders and clearly delineate territorial boundaries within the city. He continues to be the primary target for elimination, especially given his increasing influence and notoriety. One of Capone's key rivals during his time in Chicago is Joe Aiello, a member of the Sicilian Mafia. Joe orchestrated several assassination attempts on Al, the most infamous of which involves a bloody bat and the shattering of skulls. Here's how it unfolded. After multiple failed efforts, Aiello puts a bounty of $50,000 on his old adversary, which amounts to over $500,000 in today's money. The candidates are quickly identified. Two experienced hitmen who had predominantly worked for Capone in the past. A mutual acquaintance alerts Al about the imminent assassination attempt and discloses the names of the hired guns. With a bloody bat and the shattering of skulls, here's how it transpired. After several unsuccessful attempts, Aiello puts a hit on his old adversary, offering a bounty of $50,000, which is more than $500,000 today. The candidates are quickly identified, two seasoned hitmen who had primarily worked for Capone in the past. A mutual acquaintance informs Al of the impending assassination attempt and reveals the names of the hired guns. Capone invites the hitmen to lunch, fully aware that they do not yet realize he knows of their intentions. Ultimately, Capone takes a bat and violently smashes the heads of the hired guns, shocking the numerous guards present. The tale is vivid and dramatic. While its truthfulness may be questionable, it is undoubtedly striking. There are no documentary confirmations of this incident. All that is known is that the bodies of the hitmen were discovered in their car, yet the specifics of their wounds remain ambiguous. The entire narrative resembles a snowball. As with each retelling in another book or film about Capone, new controversial details emerge, and the final version strays significantly from the truth. While it's likely that he was involved in the murder, most probably because there was a hit out on him, the notion that he executed the act himself is highly unlikely. Al has always exercised great caution in this regard. For example, he never disparaged his competitors in public and refrained from mentioning such matters in his correspondence. Every effort was made to ensure he could not be linked to any wrongdoing. There was a hit out on him. However, the idea that he personally carried out the act is extremely unlikely. Al has always exercised great care in this area. For instance, he never spoke ill of his rivals in public and avoided mentioning such matters in correspondence. Every measure was taken to ensure that he could not be implicated, and this strategy has officially proven effective to this day. Capone is not guilty of any murder, making it difficult to believe in a violent reprisal involving a bat. After placing a hit on Capone, Joe Aiello would himself be killed in 1930. You can speculate for yourself about who was likely behind that. In 1928, Chicago experienced another election, and this time the conflicts escalated dramatically. Candidates received bomb packages, and shootings occurred right on the doorsteps of their own homes, primarily targeting those who opposed Al Capone. This raises a logical question. While tracing hired killings back to the instigator might be complicated, what about other activities? Bribes, illegal alcohol, underground casinos. Could it really be that the police and prosecutors failed to find any evidence linking Al Capone to arrests? Surprisingly, the answer is no. Although everyone fully understood the situation, two main reasons contributed to this: corruption and societal indifference. Let's begin with the first reason. Within the intricate structure of Capone's syndicate, hundreds of individuals were involved. Each underground beer operation, every bar or casino. Is it possible that the police and prosecutors couldn't find any evidence to directly link Al Capone for an arrest? Surprisingly, no. Even though everyone was well aware of the situation, two primary reasons prevailed: corruption and societal indifference. Let's begin with the first reason. Within the intricate structure of the Capone syndicate, hundreds of individuals were involved. Every underground beer operation, every bar or casino maintained meticulous records. A business cannot operate otherwise. And even with Capone's efforts to eliminate all traces connecting him to criminal activities, such evidence could certainly have been uncovered. Accounting books, witnesses, and so forth. The significant issue, however, was that Capone had a large number of police officers, prosecutors, and judges on his payroll. Let's assume that during another raid on a bar, law enforcement seized valuable documents. Initially, Capone's associates would attempt to bribe a lower-ranking police officer. If that officer remained principled, they would escalate their efforts up the chain of command all the way to a judge. At some point in the process, there was always someone who could either be bought or intimidated. At one point, Capone admitted to a journalist that if he were imprisoned, Chicago's economy would crumble. Countless individuals in the city relied on his business and the bribes associated with it. In 1927, even the Vice President of the United States acknowledged that the authorities were powerless to change the situation. The second factor is Al Capone's seeming invulnerability. There was a sense of popular affection, or, at the very least, tolerance towards him. Prohibition turned out to be a fascinating experiment, but what would happen if he were imprisoned? Chicago's economy would falter. Numerous individuals in the city relied on his business and the associated bribes. In 1927, even the Vice President of the United States admitted that the authorities were powerless to act against him. The second factor is Al Capone's perceived invulnerability. There was popular affection, or at least tolerance, towards him. Prohibition proved to be an intriguing yet unsuccessful experiment. Not only were there various loopholes in the law, such as allowing alcohol sales for medical or religious purposes, but many people also did not take the ban seriously. Capone, who provided ordinary workers a chance to relax with a drink after a long day, seemed quite admirable. Interestingly, it was the working class, rather than the upper elite, that generated the revenue from alcohol production and distribution. In the eyes of the common people, Al Capone successfully sustained his image as a benefactor for an extended period, instead of being perceived as a ruthless gangster. Even today, one can find accounts from ordinary employees of Capone, such as cooks or waiters, who remember him fondly. How they distinguished one aspect from another in their minds undoubtedly reflects the mafia's influence, but his impact was simply too significant. Many either benefited financially from him or enjoyed his extravagant parties, which could continue for several days non-stop. Illegal alcohol was abundant, and among the guests were high-ranking law enforcement officials, politicians, and celebrities from the entertainment and sports sectors. Al Capone felt so from the mafia's influence, but his impact was simply too substantial. Many either received money from him or were guests at his extravagant parties, which could go on for days without pause. Illegal alcohol flowed freely. Among the attendees were high-ranking law enforcement officials, politicians, and stars from the entertainment and sports sectors. Al felt so untouchable that he openly confessed to being a bootlegger in interviews with journalists. At the same time, he was appalled that none of those indulging in his alcohol faced any consequences. When I sell alcohol, they call it bootlegging. When I serve alcohol to important gentlemen on a silver platter, they call it hospitality. This famous quote from the gangster exemplifies his notoriety. To illustrate Al Capone's level of fame by the early 30s, consider these statistical facts. Between 1929 and 1931, 5 biographies of the gangster were published, and he had just turned 30 at that time. It was also during this period that Hollywood released the film Scarface, which was inspired by Capone's story. There is a prevailing sense that in the latter half of the 20s, Al Capone truly felt untouchable by power. This sentiment may have even formed in the gangster's own mind, partly explaining his swift decline. Within the detailed biographies, various accounts exist regarding when irreversible cracks began to emerge in the seemingly solid foundation of his authority. However, there is a sense that in the latter half of the 20s, Al Capone genuinely felt he was untouchable by power, and this perception likely emerged even in the gangster's own mind. This partly accounts for his swift downfall. Among the detailed biographies, multiple accounts exist regarding when irreversible cracks began to form in the seemingly solid foundation of his power. However, all theories suggest that these events occurred within a few years from 1928 to 1930. By that time, Al Capone had already acquired a home in South Florida. Unlike Chicago, the climate there is warm and sunny all year round. Capone relocated his wife and son to this new setting while he spent the winter months there. During these times, he managed the vast syndicate from afar. When the notorious St. Valentine's Day Massacre took place in Chicago on February 14th, Capone was in Florida. The gang led by Bugs Moran, whose members were the victims of the shooting, was in competition with him. Questions arose regarding who ultimately benefited from the crime, as such brutal mass killings had never occurred in the criminal underworld before. However, it was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that tipped the scales of public indifference, largely due to the influence of the media. The graphic images from the crime scene were shocking, and nearly a century later, you can still easily find the bullet-riddled bodies and rivers of blood online. At that time, in 1929, many people began to call for accountability. They had not happened. However, it was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre that shattered public indifference, mainly due to the media's power. The graphic images from the crime scene were shocking, and nearly a century later, it is still easy to find the bullet-riddled bodies and rivers of blood online. Back then, in 1929, many began to demand accountability from the main culprit, and by culprit, they were referring to Capone. The clues and leads lead to a dead end. The police have offered a reward of $60,000 for information, but even that provides no assistance. In a way, Capone is like a business that must be confronted. The next step is the pursuit of unpaid taxes. The mafia bosses lived extravagantly and openly flaunted their wealth, yet no one paid taxes, which makes sense in a way. Their income was derived from illegal activities. Shortly before this, a new provision was introduced in American tax law. The requirement to pay taxes extended even to illegal income. This is quite an intriguing system that still exists today. In the United States, there are many undocumented immigrants who live and work without rights or documentation, yet they consistently pay taxes. They are well aware of who not to cross. That would be the tax authorities. By the end of the 20s, Capone ended up in prison. Additionally, conflicts with other mafia organizations often resulted in murder. Many crime bosses disliked Capone, not only because he was highly profitable, but for several other reasons as well. And work without rights or documents. Yet, they faithfully pay their taxes. They are keenly aware of who to avoid provoking. That would be the tax authorities. By the end of the 20s, Capone found himself in prison. Additionally, conflicts with other mafia organizations often led to murder. Many crime bosses held a dislike for Capone, not only because he was highly profitable, which was a source of envy, but also because he attracted a lot of attention from the authorities. Publicity was not something that was appreciated. Al Capone was aware that someone was scheming to eliminate him, and this was expected to occur at the upcoming major gathering of mobsters in Atlantic City. In 1929, crime bosses from around the nation would converge there to effectively divide the United States into different spheres of influence. Capone was rumored to be targeted for elimination shortly after this. Al decided on a strategy he had previously employed with success: to counter the potential assassination threat by spending a brief period in prison. Due to a minor infraction, and naturally in a pleasant correctional facility where he would feel at home, Capone selects a comfortable prison near Atlantic City. After the conference wraps up, he and his associate are apprehended by a police officer for carrying firearms in public. The officer, of course, is corrupt, and the act of arrest is simply a staged performance. Capone typically did not carry a gun himself. That task was usually handled by his bodyguards. The mobster's plan succeeds, but not without notable changes. The judge imposes a substantial fine on him, and after the conference ends, a police officer apprehends him and his partner for carrying firearms on the street near a comfortable prison close to Atlantic City. The officer, of course, is corrupt, and the arrest itself is merely a staged act. Capone generally did not carry a gun. His bodyguards handled that duty. The mobster's plan works, but with significant alterations. The judge levies a substantial fine on him and imposes a year in prison instead of the few months Al had anticipated, and he will serve his time in an actual prison with dreadful conditions. The gangster's lawyer will require several months to file an appeal, and only after that will Capone begin serving his sentence. His wife visits him frequently, and from there he manages his operations in Chicago. Even the food he receives comes from the finest Italian restaurants in the vicinity. He will leave prison having gained 5 kilos. During his sentence, Capone reads Napoleon's biography. He perceives the primary tragedy of the French emperor as the moment he failed to step back from the game. For Al Capone, the fate of this historical figure becomes a metaphor for his own life. Despite his status, wealth, and notoriety, the mobster is fundamentally worn down by the incessant threat of assassination. However, by the end of the 20s, the possibility of stepping back from the game was not entirely beyond Capone's grasp. According to some reports, more than half of the city's police officers were on his payroll at that time. This indicates that he was not merely above the law, he embodied the law itself, most likely. The mobster is fundamentally worn down by the persistent threat of assassination. However, by the close of the 20s, the possibility of stepping back from the game was not entirely out of reach for Capone. According to some reports, over half of the city's police officers were accepting bribes from him. This signifies that he was not just above the law, he represented the law itself. Most likely, Capone is confident in this. He understands that the authorities possess little of substance to use against him, and if they do, it's barely anything at all. Moreover, everything can be bought and sold: police officers, witnesses, and judges. However, to pay everyone, money is required, and it is becoming increasingly scarce. The Great Depression begins in the country, affecting workers first, who are the primary patrons of bars, casinos, and brothels. Capone's income starts to decline. Simultaneously, a consensus begins to emerge among the elites. It is time to imprison Chicago's foremost mobster. If it proves impossible to capture him on charges of murder or illegal alcohol distribution, then at the very least, there are unpaid taxes to pursue. Consequently, the infamous list of enemies of the people or enemies of the state emerges in Chicago, with Capone at the top of this ranking. Furthermore, a coalition of prominent elite figures is established in the city, prepared to assist in the fight against Capone not only morally, but also financially. Among the affluent and educated, the chief gangster has never been regarded as one of their own. The infamous list of enemies of the people or enemies of the state has Capone ranked at the top. Additionally, a coalition of influential elite figures forms in the city, prepared to support the fight against Capone not only morally, but also financially. Among the affluent and educated, the main gangster has never been viewed as one of their own. Elite members could attend his parties, consume his alcohol, and even accept his bribes, but Capone had no chance of being accepted into their ranks. It is not about the amount of money or even how it was earned. Capone simply remained forever a poorly educated and somewhat ill-mannered Italian from Brooklyn. By the end of 1930, tax evasion charges are filed against two high-ranking members of the gang. Shortly after, Ralph meets a similar fate. His brother had not been as cautious with his finances, and large bank accounts opened in the names of non-existent individuals are uncovered. It is clear that the noose around Capone's neck is gradually tightening, and the most intriguing question here is, why does he remain inactive? He is a man who started his professional career in the criminal world by handling finances. There are several possibilities. First, Capone may think that the common people admire him too much to impose a lengthy prison sentence. At that moment, he opens a free soup kitchen. And here, the most intriguing question is, why does he remain inactive? He is a man who started his professional career in the criminal world by overseeing finances. There are various possibilities. First, Capone might think that the common people admire him too much to impose a long prison sentence. At this juncture, he opens a free soup kitchen for those in need, a number that has significantly risen since the onset of the Depression. Secondly, in contrast to his brother and other gang members, Capone has consistently been extremely cautious in conducting his business. He maintained no bank accounts. All money in the form of bank checks was always handled through intermediaries. He settled all transactions in cash, which is why he constantly carried a large sum of money with him. His house in Chicago is registered under his mother's name, while the house in Florida is in his wife's name. In all the accounting records of the various enterprises within the organization, Capone's name is always coded. The brief period that music. If we attempt to clarify intricate legal processes in straightforward terms, the primary question from the tax authorities essentially becomes this: where's the money, Capone? The family also has no financial needs. Nonetheless, you haven't paid any taxes, which implies that you haven't received any income in the first place, Capone. This likely turns out to be his biggest mistake. The lawyer's replies to the tax authorities' inquiries not only failed to dispel suspicions regarding Capone, but also heightened concerns for the prosecutors. The responses? It comes down to this: where's the money, Capone? The family also appears to have no needs. Still, you haven't paid any taxes, which implies that you haven't received any income from the start, Capone. This likely becomes his most significant mistake. The lawyer's responses to the tax authorities' inquiries not only failed to reduce suspicions around Capone, but also raise alarm for the prosecutors. The lawyer's replies partially affirm Capone's ties to illegal financial activities. In short, by mid-1931, imprisonment for Capone is virtually unavoidable, and the only pressing question remains: how many years? Now, let's address a few legal details that are crucial to understanding what truly happened to the king of the mafia. Al Capone and his lawyers offer a plea bargain to the prosecutors. The gangster accepts guilt on certain charges, receives a brief prison sentence, and then plans to relocate permanently to Florida. At first, it appears that the prosecutors are open to accepting this arrangement. If the deal falls apart, the case will move forward to a jury trial. First and foremost, the prosecution will still need to establish the defendant's guilt before the jurors. Additionally, this is Chicago. The evidence could be rendered ineffective, as jurors might be bribed or intimidated. There is a valid kernel of truth in the logic employed by the prosecutors pursuing tax charges against Capone. Meanwhile, the mobsters are attempting to charge him under the so-called vagrancy statute, because if the defendant hasn't paid taxes and hasn't... Furthermore, this is Chicago. The evidence could prove ineffective, as jurors might be subject to bribery or intimidation. There is a sound element of truth in the reasoning of the prosecutors pursuing tax charges against Capone. Simultaneously, the mobsters are attempting to charge him under the so-called vagrancy statute. If the defendant hasn't paid taxes and hasn't been employed, he should have been actively seeking work or applying for assistance, which Capone failed to do. One way or another, the case disintegrates in court. Witnesses decline to testify against the mobster. You can likely infer the reason. On March 1st, Capone appears in court to plead guilty to tax evasion, is sentenced to 2.5 years as part of the plea deal, and then heads off to a prison resort. To the astonishment of both the prosecution and the defense, the judge declines to accept the plea deal. This means that guilt will be decided by a jury in public sessions. In early October 1931, a trial commences in Chicago that undoubtedly earns the title of the show of the decade. The proceedings will unfold over several weeks, drawing extensive coverage not just from local, but also from national media. The audience can anticipate vibrant characters, surprising twists, and an incredible finale. Here's how the events transpired. An extended list of jurors' names was available beforehand. What does Capone's team do? That's correct. They bribe a majority of them. The proceedings will extend over several weeks. In-depth coverage will be provided not just by local, but also by national media. The audience can look forward to lively characters, surprising turns, and a spectacular finale. Here's how everything unfolded. An extensive list of jurors' names was known beforehand. What do Capone's associates do? Correct. They bribe them. Most of them, a smart move, but anticipated. Just before the first session begins, the judge replaces the entire jury. The new jurors are sequestered in a hotel, guarded heavily, and cut off from outside communication. The first week of the proceedings is a victory for the prosecution. Key witnesses connected to the gang's financial activities, operations, or Capone himself take the stand. Some of these individuals had been under witness protection until the trial. This makes perfect sense given the identity of the defendant. The prosecutors reveal the results of their investigation, which culminate in the finding of over $140,000 in unpaid taxes spanning several years. Another critical element for the prosecution is showcasing Capone's lavish spending despite his claimed unemployment. This marks the beginning of the effort to resonate with the audience, namely the jurors, most of whom are working-class individuals with modest incomes. Witnesses recount the gangster's extravagant lifestyle, his cars, suits, and parties. Ultimately, even costly silk underwear and weekly food expenses of $1,000 come to light. Meanwhile, let us not forget that the country is in the midst of the Great Depression, with many people lacking jobs and money. In other words, witnesses paint a picture of the gangster's extravagant lifestyle for the jurors, most of whom are working-class individuals with modest incomes. His cars, suits, and parties, and even costly silk underwear and weekly food expenses reaching $1,000. Meanwhile, let me remind you that the country is enduring the Great Depression, with many people lacking jobs and financial resources. In their arguments, the prosecutors reference the recent highly publicized murder of a well-known crime journalist in Chicago, claiming that Capone was responsible. What relevance does this have to the tax case? None at all. But jurors are human, and humans are emotional beings. Next, the defense enters the fray. The lawyers can argue that the regulation on declaring illegal income only came into effect in 1927, while the prosecutors introduced evidence, including data from 1925 and 1926. The attorneys could also emphasize that much of the evidence obtained during raids on establishments is inadmissible due to the expiration of the statute of limitations. The lawyers might highlight that significant expenditures are not criminal. While the prosecutors failed to effectively demonstrate illegal income, the defense overlooked this issue. Instead, they offered a series of nonsensical arguments, such as suggesting that anyone would genuinely wish to conceal their income and evade taxes. After considering all perspectives, the focus is on the reality that significant expenditures are not a criminal offense. The prosecutors inadequately demonstrated illegal income, yet the defense did not tackle this point. Instead, they offered a variety of ludicrous arguments, such as asserting that anyone would truly want to hide their income and evade paying taxes. After hearing from all sides, the jurors deliver their verdict. They acquit Capone. Nevertheless, the 5 remaining charges are sufficient for the judge to impose an unprecedented 11-year prison sentence on Al Capone for tax evasion. 50 years later, the American Bar Association will carefully examine the details of this case and determine that all the evidence presented by the prosecutors could have been effectively dismantled by a strong legal defense, leading to the defendant's acquittal. However, as the press observes in 1931, Capone's conviction for tax evasion is simply a pretext. The gangster himself thinks that his fall from grace was caused by excessive media attention. The defense's appeal against the verdict is predictably rejected, and a year later, at the age of 33, Alphonse Capone begins serving his sentence. There are many legends about the conditions of Capone's imprisonment. In Atlanta, some inmates have talked about the gangster's luxurious lifestyle, gourmet meals, high-end bedding, and even illicit substances that Capone was allegedly using. However, he portrays a vastly different reality. The former mafia king lives like an ordinary prisoner. Most days he spends his time repairing shoes or cleaning floors. In his free time, he is permitted to play. In Atlanta, some inmates discuss the gangster's extravagant lifestyle, gourmet meals, luxurious bedding, and even illegal substances that Capone was reportedly using. This paints a vastly different picture. The former king of the mafia lives the life of an average inmate. Most days he spends his time repairing shoes or cleaning floors. During his free time, he is permitted to play bass in a musical group as a reward for good behavior. And Capone conducts himself quite well. This presents his opportunity to significantly shorten his sentence. Likely, this is how Capone would have spent the rest of his days in prison. However, U.S. President Roosevelt suggests the concept of a special facility for especially dangerous criminals. The name of this correctional institution is familiar to everyone today: Alcatraz. The top mobster is relocated to the prison on the island in San Francisco Bay. For Capone, this signifies the beginning of the end. The Prohibition era is coming to a close, and the criminal organization is steadily losing its former prominence. At Alcatraz, Capone certainly does not receive a warm welcome. The prison was constructed, among other purposes, to strip dangerous criminals of any chance to live comfortably. Initially, the infamy of the former top gangster guarantees his safety. Other inmates are afraid of Capone. However, they soon discover that he is incarcerated for tax-related crimes rather than murder or racketeering. Reports indicate that after this revelation, Capone is assaulted. At least one attack has been recorded in the medical files. Criminals are stripped of any chance to lead a comfortable lifestyle. At first, the infamy of the former top gangster guarantees his safety. Other inmates fear Capone. However, they soon find out that he is imprisoned for tax offenses, not for murder or racketeering. There are reports that following this, Capone is assaulted. At least one incident has been recorded in the medical files. An inmate stabbed Capone, but the injuries were not severe. At Alcatraz, Capone's health is not critically impacted. The symptoms remain mild, so he does not receive any treatment. He continues to act well, hoping for an early release, and earns a promotion from shoemaker to prison librarian. Capone develops an interest in religion and reads various books, one of which is titled Life Begins at 40. Given his eventful life, it's hard to believe he ended up in Alcatraz at the age of 35. Visits from his wife are permitted only once a month. She observes the decline in her husband's health and writes letters urging his transfer to a facility with improved conditions. However, it is not until 5 years in Alcatraz that these requests are granted. By that time, doctors have already documented the severe effects of syphilis on Capone's brain. For instance, he may struggle to return to his cell, his speech can become slurred, and he starts to mumble things that are unintelligible. Occasionally, Alfonso simply babbles nonsensically. He is then transferred to a prison near Los Angeles where conditions are more favorable. During his time in Alcatraz, these requests are eventually granted. By this point, doctors have already recognized the severe effects of syphilis on Capone's brain. For instance, he may struggle to return to his cell, his speech can become sluggish, and he starts to mumble unintelligibly. At times, Alfonso simply babbles incoherently. He is moved to a prison near Los Angeles with improved living conditions. Less than a year later, Capone is granted early release. Immediately afterward, he is taken to a hospital where he receives proper treatment for syphilis. According to the doctor, by the time he is admitted, the disease has impacted Capone's brain to such an extent that his mental age resembles that of a 7-year-old child. The treatment provides only a slight improvement in his condition. According to the doctor's prognosis, with adequate care, Capone could live long enough to reach old age. However, it is impossible to fundamentally rectify the established issues in his brain. Capone will continue to intermittently babble incoherently, including talking to deceased individuals. At times, he becomes aggressive and uncontrollable, all of which is also a consequence of the disease. Newspapers publish sensational headlines claiming that the former top gangster is utterly insane and disconnected from reality. Around the same time, a tale surfaces about the disturbed mobster allegedly sitting by the pool at his home in Florida, fishing while convinced he is on a dock. This story is nothing more than a myth, just like the infamous photo of Capone with a fishing rod. The top gangster is entirely insane and disconnected from reality. Concurrently, a story arises about how the delusional mobster is allegedly perched with a fishing rod by the pool at his Florida home, trying to catch fish while believing he is sitting on a dock. This tale is merely a myth, whereas the well-known photo of Capone with a fishing rod and cigar was indeed captured during a fishing trip on the dock, where Capone was experiencing the effects of neurosyphilis. However, this was more evident in his periodically occurring symptoms than in the sense that he had wholly lost his mind. Despite the doctor's conclusion that Capone's mental faculties would never recover, his wife and many family members still hold on to the hope that he will soon improve and return to managing the crime syndicate. It is likely that the relatives are simply deceiving themselves, as Al Capone has long stopped participating in the gang's activities, and his brother's influence has also greatly diminished. The family then encounters financial difficulties. The former gang allocates some funds, but it's barely sufficient to meet their basic needs. This presents a noteworthy point. The wife and other relatives are so reluctant to abandon their comfortable lifestyle that they eagerly anticipate Capone's return to his criminal activities, fully aware of what he is involved in. Incidentally, this fact also dispels many rumors about his situation. It barely covers basic needs, which is quite interesting. The wife and other relatives are so resistant to giving up their comfortable lifestyle that they eagerly anticipate Capone's return to his criminal activities, fully aware of his dealings. Additionally, this fact also disproves numerous rumors about Capone having vast wealth. By the time of his death, he will be virtually broke. Following the mobster's release from prison, an unforeseen family event takes place. The elder brother Jimmy suddenly resurfaces after being absent for 30 years. It turns out he had aimed to conquer Hollywood and act in cowboy films, but never succeeded and eventually settled in the western part of the country, adopting the name Richard Hart. There is a belief that he is the only brother in the Capone clan who stayed on the right side of the law, but this isn't completely accurate. Jimmy did serve as a sheriff and, ironically, fought against bootleggers, but his life wasn't without challenges. Despite claims from Jimmy and his family that he served in Europe during World War I, there are no records to corroborate this. However, it is widely known that he faced several theft charges. Jimmy Capone eventually chose to return to his relatives solely because he had run out of money, and this was his only option. His family asserted that he served in Europe during World War I, but there are no records to back this up. What is well documented, however, is that he faced several theft charges. In the end, he opted to return to his relatives solely because he had exhausted his funds, making it his only escape. In the latter part of his life, after being released from prison, the former mafia boss lives as someone much older than his mid-40s. Alphonse spends his time tending to the garden, swimming in the pool, and going fishing, while gradually being affected by dementia. Capone is surrounded by loved ones who provide him with constant care throughout the day. In early 1947, Alphonse Capone's heart fails amid a bout of pneumonia. This signifies the close of the criminal dynasty. Albert will not engage in criminal activities. Instead, he will attempt a career in the restaurant business, although with limited success. When Albert decides to seek a loan from his father's former gang, he will be denied. At first glance, Al Capone's life resembles an exhilarating movie. Shootouts, bootlegging, political machinations, and gang wars. Elements we often witness in classic gangster films that are largely inspired by Capone himself. He is almost always portrayed wearing hats and suits, with a cigar in his mouth. Yet, The true tale of Gangster No. 1 is more reminiscent of a nuanced drama from Martin's cinematic repertoire. Movies, shootouts, bootlegging, political intrigues, and gang wars. These are the hallmarks of classic gangster films, many of which are inspired by Capone's own persona. He is typically portrayed donning hats and suits with a cigar in his mouth. However, the genuine narrative of Gangster No. 1 resembles a complex drama from Martin Scorsese's body of work. The protagonist opts for a seemingly straightforward and rapid route to success through crime, yet the ladder he ascends is actually leading him downward. As he progresses, the path only grows deeper and darker. Retribution is destined to confront the hero in the end. Music. It appears there is no text available for me to format. Please provide the text you would like me to work on, and I will be glad to assist you.